I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by David Edwards, who's our new statistical expert at ETOA. And we're looking at one of the oldest canards in the book, which is the theory that Americans don't travel during an election year. I remember when I was in charge of all the tour guides many years ago at American Express, when it was a travel company, the tour guides used to get terribly depressed every 4 years because they were convinced they would be facing a comparative slump because Americans don't travel when elections take place. And if we look at the sort of literature on this, insofar as there is literature on this, and I'm just opening up my presentation as I speak, it's often cited. I mean, Travel Agent Central very recently said, how does a US presidential election affect travel? Conventional wisdom says travel decreases in these years. And asked if its agents had noticed the pattern, Valerie Wilson Travel co-president Kimberly Wilson-Wetty said, absolutely. I've been watching election years for 20 years, and presidential election years are definitely unstable and bumpy. Most presidential election years create uncertainty because we wonder, well, who will be in charge and what will change or stay the same, not just in the White House, but in Congress. Years when it is not a re-election year are even more unstable, and travelers are often skittish. So, I mean, this is a really, really well-established pattern, and I hear it quite often when people speculate about the American market. Now, but if you actually look at the data, and the data for outbound American travelers leaving the United States is published every year by the US State Department, and it's reasonably good data. It's a survey like other sources of data that we have, but it's a reasonably significant survey, and it's reasonably accurate. And if you look at this graph, you will see that election years do not mean that fewer people travel. In the 2004 election, there was substantially more people traveling to Europe from the United States than there were in 2003. 2008, which was definitely the beginning of a financial slump, there was definitely a decrease against 2007, but in 2012 and in 2016, both of those election years saw increases of travelers to Europe. So there's really no obvious statistical evidence for this to take place. David, is there anything you'd like to say about this graph before I close it and we get on to a more general discussion on this topic?
I do love a graph, Tom. So, I guess, yeah, I can recall when I was first getting involved in tourism data back in 2003, going to an IPK European Travel Commission meeting over in Pisa. And one of the topics of debate that year was, oh, what's going to happen in 2004? Because guess what? It's a presidential election year. So you're absolutely right. This is a contention that has been around for a very long time, but I think that the graph does tell a fairly clear and compelling story.
Well, let's close the graph. Get back to you. I think, yeah, it does that, but there must be some truth in it. I mean, there's no smoke without fire, as they say. And I suppose on one level, if you want an example of people not traveling in an election year, 2020 might be the sort of pin-up model example. But do you think there is, notwithstanding 2020, do you think there's any reason for this assumption?
Well, you're absolutely right that 2020 is going to be the case that proves that argument, even if it's doing so for completely different reasons. But long, long ago, it was once said that a week is a long time in politics, but it's more true that a year is a long time in tourism. And I think that we need to really think about, well, when do US presidential elections actually happen? Yes, you might argue that the build-up happens for perhaps a year or more in advance, but the actual election is in November. And this is a really relatively quiet time of year for Americans traveling particularly to Europe. Yes, they may be thinking about traveling to sunnier climes, but if you look at the seasonal pattern of Americans coming to Europe, November's definitely not peak month. So I think it's wrong to say that people don't travel because of the election itself. I think it's perhaps a different kettle of fish in terms of does who is in the White House have an impact on overall travel patterns. Then yes, I think you can make a case that the broader policies that might be put in place by different presidents may impact either favorably or unfavorably on the volume of outbound travel. But the election itself in November, I guess I don't really buy that, apart from a small rump of people perhaps in DC who are highly involved in politics who may travel less in the run up to an election. But for your average American who does travel internationally, it's probably not a great consideration when they're thinking, am I going to go to Europe this year? Oh, no, I'm not going to go because I have to be around to vote in November.
And it's possible, I suppose, that some people may feel, I suppose, more domestically focused, if I can use that term, when the news is on the presidential election and the contest and the build up to that contest throughout the year. But I suppose just as many people who feel that they ought to be at home to take part in or witness the debate prior to the election, an equal number of people probably want to feel they have to get out because they've had enough of it. So there's no, all we can say is there's no pattern that proves this point. In fact, the pattern seems to disprove the idea that Americans don't travel in an election year, 2020 notwithstanding. David, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tom.